All right, hello everyone, and welcome to People Nerds' September webinar. We are excited to welcome Google's Michelle Carney, who is going to be describing just some of the ways that user experience research can help humanize machine learning. I will turn things over to a person I've had the pleasure to work with on this deck, learning a lot, I must say, in just the few weeks I've been working with her. Michelle Carney. Michelle, thank you so much. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Ben. Oh my gosh, this is so cool. This is like such a dream come true too, because I'm a huge fan of Dscout. So really excited to share my practice with y'all. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time. Really excited to just kind of get into it. Okay, so hello. We're going to talk about machine learning and user experience. You are now tuned in to the People Nerds, how UX research can and should humanize machine learning. If you are in the wrong webinar, that's okay. I won't look. You can leave. No. Okay, cool. So really quickly, a little bit about my background. Hey, I'm Michelle. I'm a senior UX researcher on ML and AI at Google's AI UX team. I'm also the founder and organizer of the Machine Learning and User Experience Meetup. I also lecture down at the Stanford D School, and a little bit about my previous experience. I actually come from more of the data science machine learning side. I was a computational neuroscientist turned UX researcher, have done some UI engineering too. So really excited to share a little bit about my practice and what I've learned about combining these two fields in interesting ways. I thought today for an agenda is we could just start off like, hey, what is machine learning and UX? I can share some of the cool stuff around the People in AI Guidebook from this brand new team that I just joined at Google. And then we can move into a typical UX research case study. I've kind of like boiled up some of my best practices into a sample case study that I would typically use if I'm building out a machine learning system. So hopefully some of it's useful to you. I do want to couch this in that this is a brand new and emerging field. So don't worry if you are like, oh no, I'm doing something a little bit different. Like that's totally fine. I'm sure a lot of the folks tuning in are UX designers, UX researchers. You are an expert in your own field. I'm just going to share some of my experience and my knowledge in this. And if there's some parts that really resonate with you, awesome. If there's some parts where you're like, that's less applicable to me, that's also okay and fine. Also, going to put it out there, super interested in how you do this approach. So yeah, so let's get started. And like Ben mentioned, if you could hold your questions to the end and then we can circle back to them. Cool. So what is machine learning and UX? If you've been to the meetup, I always cover this too, but how I like to describe it is, how do we use data to drive and inform UX design decisions, but also how do we design to help our end user understand what's going on with these models, where that data is coming from, what type of data is being used, and make more transparent and controllable machine learning AI experiences. And I know I've just simplified it up here with UX and data, but UX is as I'm sure a lot of us know, more than just visual design. It's interaction design, it's UX research, it's voice user interface design, all that stuff. And data here too, I'm kind of simplifying it as well. If there's any data scientists or machine learning experts, I'm couching that like for artificial intelligence, data analysis, even stats, like all of that too. How do we use these two disciplines to kind of help design better experiences? Like some of these are some of my favorites. Hope the GIFs aren't too slow over the webinar, but on the left we have Pinterest's visual discovery tool. So what's happening is someone searched for something and they're browsing a bunch of images and they're like, oh, this pizza looks great. I actually want to reseed my search. Instead of going back up to the top, I want more pizzas that look like this. So then it updates the query with a bunch of other samples of pizza, which is a really powerful computer vision model, which is awesome, but it's built into a really nice user experience. And other really great examples of this too can be like Google's Type Ahead, or how it finds GIFs on the Google keyboard, or the Google Creative Labs Quick Draw and Auto Draw is also a total favorite of mine. If you've never played around with it, totally can share out that link too. So if you're interested in topics like this, good news, we have a meetup on it. So like I mentioned, about 2 years ago, I founded the Machine Learning and User Experience Meetup out here in San Francisco. And we've grown a ton. We're at a little over 1,800 approaching 2,000 members. So we hold like monthly events to try to share out these best practices, these case studies, both from like the design side, so like how do you be a product designer on an AI system, as well as from the machine learning side. So like how do you use like unsupervised learning methodology in order to make data-driven personas? Like that's an example talk. Yeah, so we have about monthly events, and this is what they typically look like. So we've had the pleasure of partnering with some really, really great companies like Salesforce, IDEO, Google, Amazon, as well as like smaller startup incubator hubs too, to find out like what are some other novel approaches that folks are working on. Like our next one is actually at Capgemini. We've partnered with Alternative before. So yeah, we've just had the pleasure of partnering with a lot of really great folks and learning about like, hey, in this new and emerging field, how do you approach designing for AI systems? How do you approach using machine learning for UX or UX to inform machine learning systems, all that type of stuff. So like I mentioned, if you're interested in this, totally come and check us out. I'll share some links afterwards too. But when I started this field or this meetup, there really wasn't a lot yet in the field. It's only recently that we've started seeing jobs like at IDEO, which is a design group. They now have a data science practice, which is so exciting to me. It's a lot of like machine learning prototyping, which is really cool, as well as like actual job descriptions, like this one from Apple, which is like, we're looking for a UX UI designer to bridge the gap between design and machine learning. Like that is so cool. That was like not a thing when I started the meetup 2 years ago. So super excited about that, as well as we're seeing roles around UX research for AI and machine learning systems. And while this is super exciting too, I think it's also important to share best practices and like just any guidelines or help along the way too, because it is a new and emerging field. So want to also say too, after doing the meetup, I had the pleasure of teaching at the Stanford D-School a course on designing machine learning. So this is something that is publicly available. All the materials are up online. I'm just going to give this a shout out in case you're interested. We've created a ton of artifacts like AI ethics and this one around what parts of machine learning can be designed. I am writing up a Medium article on this, so check out the D-School Medium account in the next couple days because that should be up soon. But these are tools that are out there if you want to do a workshop to help align your team about, you know, hey, what are we actually designing, all this stuff. So those are publicly available tools. Just wanted to give them a shout out as well. But my day-to-day actually involves a lot of UX research for machine learning and AI systems. Like I mentioned, I just recently got a new job. Yay! I am a senior UX researcher for Google AI's AI UX team. And they're the larger team that has the people and AI research team on it. And you might be familiar with this. It's the People and AI Guidebook. This is something that I am a huge fan of, a huge reason why I joined this team. I just think it's fantastic. It's a compilation of over 100 folks here at Google, designers, researchers, and more, machine learning scientists, coming together, doing an audit on hey, how do we, like, what are examples of AI machine learning systems that we've made before in the past? What are some major categories? And these 6 chapters kind of bubbled up. So they're on user needs and defining success, data collection and evaluation, mental models, explainability and trust, and feedback, controls, and errors and failing gracefully. So there's a lot in there. Like I mentioned, this is a compilation of like dozens, if not hundreds of folks coming together to like share their knowledge, get something out there that can help others. Like I mentioned, this is an emerging field. So it is something that like, this is the current state, but it could also really potentially change in the future too. I'm just going to highlight like 3 of my favorite chapters. I mean, they're all very important chapters, especially for UX research, but 3 that I use all the time when I do user research are around mental models, feedback and control, and errors and failing gracefully. So kind of going into that, in the mental models chapter, they really discuss like understanding your user's point of view. And this is the just a screenshot from the website too, around like, hey, like, key questions you should be asking are like, what aspects of AI should we explain to our users? How should we introduce AI to the users initially and thereafter? Like, how does it change over time? What are some of the pros and cons of introducing our AI as human-like as well? Because you can imagine if there's a mental model of like, oh, can behave like a human, and then it can't do human-like functions. Like, it might be good to let the user know about some limitations of these types of AI systems. So that chapter is fantastic on that. The other one that I love is on feedback and control, which is really about learning from your users. This is super important. I know there's another one on data and collection stuff too, but if you are not already aware, I'm sure all of us are, machine learning cannot happen without data. So when you release a new feature and everything too, already having feedback from previous users about like how they potentially might want to use it or what they're trying to do or something too can help build out future models that aren't already in the product yet. So in the feedback and control section, there's really great questions too about like how should the AI request and respond to user feedback, questions around like AI interpreting both implicit and explicit user feedback, which I think is fantastic because sometimes there might be more implicit type behaviors that we're seeing, and then when the user actually goes out of their way to give explicit feedback, like that's also extremely valuable, and how we should be able to take that and use that to improve the system as well. And then also this notion of control and customization. So like a lot of folks feel like AI is just something that happens to them. Like how do we make them feel like they're more in control, that they're working with the AI, they can control it. Our end users understand, and I'm sure all of us understand too, that machine learning is something that can allow for immense customization and personalization and a ton of benefits, but it really is a bummer when it feels like, oh, this is just my algorithm changing and like I have no control over this. I have no idea what happened to my favorite playlist. Like I listened to like one song by like Jimi Hendrix, now everything's all skewed towards Jimi Hendrix, like stuff like that. So how do you allow for that type of control? There's a bunch of great things in that chapter. And the last one that I want to mention too, kind of similar with the feedback, is around on errors and failing gracefully, really about improving your AI system. So it's really important to note too that for machine learning is probabilistic. So there will be times when it gets it wrong, and that's great. Use that as an opportunity instead of like, oh no, this is a failure. How do you allow that to get more feedback on that model, on that system, on how people are using it? And so designing for those types of ways too are also really, really important for improving the AI system. And in this chapter, they discuss things like, when do users consider low confidence predictions to be an error? Like what does that look like to them? How will we reliably identify sources of error in a complex AI? And does AI allow users to move forward after an AI failure? All super, super important questions, especially when you're doing research and stuff too. So just wanted to call these out as some of my favorites from even before I joined this awesome team here at Google. I think that it's awesome. There are a ton of other great resources. I am just pulling out the very high level from those chapters. Definitely dig in, look through all this. It's fantastic. Huge fan, like I mentioned. But it's one thing to talk about like these chapters at a high level, and it's another thing to actually then go through and try to practice this. So I thought that we could try a case study where we actually try to internalize, hey, what does it mean to think about mental models, think about feedback and control, think about failing gracefully and everything too. So for this, I have extrapolated away at like a very high level, kind of like some best practices that I have learned along my times about doing UX research on machine learning models before they're built yet. And I've made up a sample case study on personalized travel. So we're going to pretend that we are working on a brand new AI ML powered system that is going to revolutionize personalized travel. It's all about like recommending the perfect place for you, for your family, whatever. But we might not know exactly like how to get started. Is this a brand new system? Is it going to live in a smart assistant? Like what does that actually look like? So I'm going to share a little bit about my approach to this and like how I would typically think about testing a system like this, especially if it's in a brand new domain. I know this is kind of a silly example because there's a lot of other competitive offerings out there, but bear with me while you see the high level things that I might try. Cool. So what I tend to use like a three-pronged approach, which starts with some generative research, even before like we might have an idea of what we want the ML or AI system to do, but really diverging before we converge on like, hey, what are all possible worlds? What are things and product offerings that our customers might want that we aren't currently offering, all that type of stuff. Then once we have some ideas, narrowing that down and creating a concept, and then maybe doing some moderated testing around that and really getting feedback on like, does this make sense? And then once we have the model actually in a good place, that's when I move forward with evaluating a prototype. And that's when I might use a moderated testing like Dscout. Like I mentioned too, this is a new field, new emerging field. So like there might be some points in this where you're like, yes, I totally need the generative research stuff, or I totally need evaluating your prototype. Like that's great. If the rest of it doesn't resonate with you, that's also totally fine. This is just something that I found works really well when I'm working on new products, and would want to share with all y'all too. So yeah, so let's get into the generative research. So in generative research, like I had mentioned, it's really important to think like broadly, like, hey, what are some ways that people are typically solving this, but also like if we're thinking about recommendations, maybe like how would people recommend these to each other? Is there anything of like how human to human recommendations work or anything like that too? So it's super important, like I mentioned, for new domains as well, like smart home devices, voice assistants. So one thing that I have tried that we can kind of speculate is recommendations between people. So bringing folks into the same room, getting them together, actually having them recommend to each other. How would you recommend travel? Maybe giving them a list of their top 3 places or something like that beforehand, and they could do their own research on the side, and they come in and ask each other questions. And I've seen, if we're in this personalized travel domain, I've seen some really, really great stuff around folks talking about yeah, so who are you traveling with? When do you want to travel? Why do you want to travel? Like, what is the modality of your travel really important? And that's fantastic, because if I was just doing like a competitive audit of like the current state of the personalized travel, I might just converge on the same solution. But, by having folks like watching and understanding how folks are prioritizing it, asking questions of each other, that helps me understand too, like what are possible different mental models that they might have about like recommendations on travel, rather than just being told like, or more of like a search and command control system of like, oh yeah, I want to go to Roswell, New Mexico, and like this is exactly how you do it. It might be more like, oh, like what are some types of experiences you want to have, that kind of stuff. So fantastic. Can't recommend it enough. Another method that I would super recommend you look into, which could be a whole talk in and of itself, is actually TripTech. It's a tool for generative research. It's really, really great on prioritization. So it was pioneered by some folks here at Google, also on the broader AI UX team, really about like, hey, early stage machine learning concepts and prototypes. How can we understand users' mental models, how they would prioritize different things over each other? There's a fantastic Kai paper from this year on it too. Some of you might have seen it. But the huge win on this is actually they did a lot of concepting and everything too to draft the UX requirements for the now playing on any Android devices, or Pixel 2, sorry. So if you leave your phone out, it can then identify like, hey, what music is in the background and stuff too. And they came up with this through this TripTech experience. They've used it for a couple other projects too, and so they've documented that process and made it accessible to anyone. I think there's also a video on it too, so can't recommend it enough. That's a really exciting way to start with that generative research. Then moving on from there, you might do how I might analyze this too is thinking about like, okay, well, we saw 8 different conversations about how people recommend things to each other. I'm now going to affinity diagram, like these are the types of words and modifiers that people are expecting to use. These are the types of actions or ways that they might want to filter it or pull out major findings that way. And then moving on, you can then use that to inform a concept that you build. And concept here could be like an early stage prototype. You want to use that feedback from the generative research to really inform this. So if you're hearing from all these different participants like, oh, it's super important to account for multiple travelers, or I would rather prioritize the date in which I'm going rather than the place, or something like that, or maybe vice versa, allowing for that flexibility. So use that to inform the concepts. I know travel is something that's very well thought out. So imagine this is a future ML or AI system. This I might do like through a moderated in-person usability study or a Wizard of Oz study if I'm doing something possibly on voice. If you're not familiar with that type of methodology, no worries. This is a type of methodology where you might have like a couple of key voice user interactions, or even it can be done on visual as well. I have done it a lot on voice, and I would probably have them pulled up as audio files on my computer and Bluetooth into a smart home or another smart speaker, have a moderator in the room with the participant, and have the moderator explain to the participant like, hey, this is a brand new prototype. It might not work as you'd expect, but go ahead and give it a try. And it's actually me on the other end who's sending forward like the designs that we have in the voice user interface, testing out if that works, if that doesn't work. So similar to the Wizard of Oz, don't pay attention to the person behind the screen. It is actually me, Bluetoothed in from the other room. So fantastic method, as well as paper prototyping. And instead of full screens mocked up in paper prototyping, I might use more of a modular type design. So like having a couple, like one base piece of paper, but then having a couple of different things that I might sub in as you quote unquote interact with the concept, if that makes sense. So, but having it moderated is really important. And it really is like testing out the concept. You do not need your machine learning model yet. Like this is a really important thing. Machine learning models take time to build. And I'm sure as some of us know who work on these concepts and everything too, when the machine learning initially is started, it's actually not very good. And it takes time to train them, to tweak them, to optimize hyperparameters, all that stuff. So for evaluating the concepts, you don't need any of the machine learning yet. You can actually just test out like the North Star of the experience. You as a UX researcher or UX designer, you are really designing and testing like what will the machine learning experience be. And remember that like you are an expert in testing out these things, and machine learning is just a little bit different in the sense that it's not as easy to necessarily prototype it. It might be a little bit more probabilistic and everything too, but it still has like inputs and outputs. So inputs could be things like that are going into the model. Maybe they go through an out-of-box experience or something like that. And the outputs, that's actually going to be what's in the interface or the design or what they're actually selecting. So making sure that that's like, hey, are we designing the right experience for this ML system? Also thinking through like, although we've done the generative research around like, hey, what types of mental models do people have when they are doing personalized travel or personalized something? Personalization has a lot of machine learning, and what types of things do they think would inform that? But also like, what does this actually line up in the concept? And what I'm talking about the concept too, I think it's important to note the tangible artifact. One thing that I do is create a quote unquote custom prototype for every participant. This might sound scary because custom prototype for every participant, like yikes, like that is a lot of custom prototypes. But it actually doesn't need to be super in detail. It could just be something where there's a couple of custom elements. And where do you get the custom information? I actually do a survey to all the potential participants, whoever I'm screening to come in. And within that survey, I ask questions that can inform the prototype. Like, so if, for instance, Ben, if you were going to come in and I'm screening you, I might have a survey that says, great, tell me about the last time you traveled. What were some of the places you've traveled to? Okay, how often do you travel? Where are your top 3 places that you want to travel? Where's 1 or 2 places where you're really not interested in traveling? Things like that too. And you might forget that you've answered your top 3 favorite places and like bottom 3 favorite places. And that might be something that I then inform what feels like a personalized system within the prototype. This can be mocked up in systems like using Sketch and then Envision. And it doesn't need to be the entire prototype then updated. It could just be a couple of elements like I mentioned. I also want to stress that it's okay that the prototype isn't exactly perfect like the machine learning system. Machine learning is sometimes wrong. Like that's why there's a whole chapter on failing gracefully in the guidebook, right? Because machine learning is probabilistic. So this is another reason too why I ask for like maybe least favorite or places that would be not a good fit. So that way we do get some sample answers of like wrong, machine learning gone wrong and like very wrong and like how people would want to fix that. So the Dscout team has mocked up a wonderful app for me on travel time. Here we're like highlighting, like you can imagine all of them have color or something too, but you know, maybe just the first like landing screen has those custom parts that have been informed by the survey. So if Ben was coming in, maybe we would have, like Ben mentioned, LA, Paris, and New York City as like his top places to travel, but Roswell's not on that list. So having that immediately as you get to the landing page, telling your end user like, oh, this is like a prototype, it might not work as you'd expect. It's, you know, from a server on Mars, like, you know, what do you think about this? And some key questions too that I try to use to guide my practice too. Then the other thing that I want to mention before I move into those key questions are around interactions of that. So you also don't need to feel like you need to create a fully functioning prototype for all of them. You might just do 1 or 2 screens and have them reflect like, okay, yeah, Ben, you wanted to go to Paris. Let's pretend you clicked on Paris, but click on LA instead. Like, what would you be thinking about? Like that kind of stuff too. Asking questions about the types of outputs that the model might give, how you want them visualized, all that stuff too. Yeah, so moving into those key questions that I would ask about a concept, I would definitely ask questions about like, if this was a personalized travel, you know, AI system, is this what you expected? Why or why not? Are there other things that you thought that the system was going to recommend that it didn't? Oh, are you surprised that it's places rather than modalities of travel? Like that's another thing too. Lining up with those mental models. Also asking questions around like, where does this data come from? But of course, like, having you, that's a very loaded term of like, where does this data come from? So asking maybe more pseudo-anthropomorphic questions about like, how did the model know this? Like, where does the model find out that you want to go to LA or that kind of stuff too? Equally as important, asking what happens when the model is wrong. So we have like Roswell here. Maybe that's not like, that's like, no, I'm really good. I'm not super into aliens. Like, I'm fine. So, okay, great. Ben, what would you do to change that? Like, how would you give the system feedback that you're really not interested in Roswell? It's like the 4th thing on the page. So like, you know, how would you want to change that? Why do you think the model is recommending that too? That's another really important one too. And then another way you might approach this as well is thinking, having them speculate about how this would change over time, possibly doing 2 different prototypes and being like, okay, like pretend that this is a week later and you come back to this, or pretend that you traveled to LA and now you've come back what would you expect to see? So having them kind of speculate about like the concept, the interaction. Like I mentioned, this is not machine learning powered at the moment. This is very much like, okay, we know that this is going to be a machine learning personalized experience, but we were really testing, like, are we building the right type of machine learning experience? Cool. So from there, you've now done the generative research, you've evaluated the concept. Now your machine learning model is kind of built, and you actually want to evaluate a semi-working prototype. So this is like, you've given the feedback back to the engineers and the machine learning scientists about like, okay, like we really need to be thinking about like, you know, giving feedback when the system is wrong, and maybe that's not even machine learning powered, maybe that's just logic about like you then hide things once people say that they don't want them shown. And then you can work with them to actually get an MVP of the ML model working in a prototype that you can maybe give access to end users and everything too. This I would actually recommend doing unmoderated, and for the reasons behind this, you can get a bunch of folks at scale. I like coupling like a contextual inquiry as well as like usability on the model prototype together in the same test, because it's really, really rich data around like, hey, how are people currently solving this problem? Now, if we give them access to the system, like how does this help? Does this hurt? Okay, we already saw that Ben solves this problem this way, and this model doesn't account for that. So that's something too, and they can answer it on their own time. And again, unmoderated is great too, because you can get feedback at scale. You will get edge cases that you would not have gotten just by moderated in-person testing too. People are going to be doing it maybe like on the fly, like they're really booking a travel experience, and you know, then they try it on your app, and they really give you some great feedback around that. So when I do this type of testing, like I mentioned, I start with a control portion where we really talk about like, hey, show us maybe 3 entries around how you currently plan trips. Like, are you planning a trip right now? What have you done in the past? Do a screen capture on that too, about like what are you looking for when you plan a trip and everything as well. And then moving then, I give them access to the prototype. So that's my experimental condition of like, now try using this prototype to plan a trip. What do you notice? Is there anything that, you know, works really well? Like maybe this could be a selfie recording. This could be a screen recording. Really understanding like, how are they trying to use this prototype? And then I end with a reflection. So, hey, you've now seen this ML AI system try to help you do personalized travel. Do you have any feedback? Do you have any thoughts? Do you have any ideas? Anything else come to mind too that we might be missing that we didn't get from the generative or the evaluating the concept part? So the kind folks at Dscout have mocked up how I would typically do this in Dscout, which I think is awesome. You don't need to do it in Dscout, but I just think that Dscout is fantastic for doing this type of work, because if you aren't familiar, if you're new to Dscout too, Dscout, how I describe it is it's kind of like Snapchat meets Qualtrics. So you're able to do surveys coupled with like video captures, like short video captures, and annotate, log them, bookmark them, tag them, collaborate with your other researchers or designers. It's honestly fantastic. Huge fan. So this would be a sample screen that the participant might see. So like, hey, in a 60-second video, show us what resources you typically use to travel destinations. You could also ask a couple survey questions too, if you kind of know the competitive field. If you're like, oh, okay, I know that folks are using like this service, or this service. Let's have them like tag that for us so we can kind of see at scale what's happening too. And there might be interesting interactions that you weren't expecting as well. So things like, oh, I use this service and then I transition into this service. So if you were maybe just asking people like, how do you book travel? They might only show you one, but it's really important to actually get both. So that way you understand when you introduce your personalized ML travel system into their ecosystem, they can then like you understand like how they might use that in practice. So this would be a type of video. Let's see if it plays.
All right, so I'm here on the Kayak app, and I am going to see about flying to Chicago around Halloween. So Let's see if we get any deals. I typically use Kayak because it really has a clean UI. It's very easy for me to see the flights, the costs, and in particular the time. So I can go through and I can, this looks like a pretty good flight. $300 round trip is pretty cheap too. So I will want to look at that a little more. And I typically just go on time in the air and price. Those are the two things that I really look for.
Yeah, so that's fantastic. There's a ton of really rich information there. You know, the participant said like sometime around Halloween, like, oh, maybe like holiday travel is something really important. So Dscout also lets you tag those types of things too, which I think is awesome. So you could, you know, mention like, oh, this is like possible holiday travel or something like that too. You could also, the participant very clearly states like, oh, like time in the air and price are key things for me. So really like pulling that out, logging that somewhere, so that way you can double check that with like, you can get like the numbers too about like, oh, like, you know, 30 out of our 90, you know, entries around this actually said like price is the most important. So maybe on our UI, we actually need to include the price, or like an average price or something like that. So I also would ask for probably at least 3 entries around this too, in this control condition, because I think it's really important to like get a couple of like, not just like a typical case. So sometimes I even ask questions around like, hey, how typical is this for you? Is this a normal thing that you would do? Are you kind of asking like, are you going out of your way to show me this, or is this something that you always do? I do see a bunch of chat things coming in too, just as a meta note. If you could use the Q&A portion, that would be awesome, because Ben is actually monitoring that and using the upvote system to figure out what questions we use. Okay. So cool. We did the control condition. We got a bunch of entries around that. Fantastic. We logged it. We had a great time with our other collaborators, you know, going through analyzing this. Also in Dscout too, it allows you to highlight stuff. So like that's super useful. Now we could do the same thing, give them access to the actual prototype. So we can ask them, great, thank you so much for showing us how you would typically plan a trip. Now we're going to give you access to this prototype. If you could try to go through that as well. You know, what are some things that, did it work as you'd expect? Similar to what you would ask in the evaluating the concept stage. This one, our participant Ben did a selfie, which is awesome, and walked us through like, hey, like this is, you can actually see the transcript down below about like, oh, it was very visual, like awesome. I kept scrolling, I couldn't find the search. It's like great feedback. So you're getting both like usability feedback as well as like model usability feedback too. Asking maybe some questions too about like, what did you think about the recommendations? Were there any recommendations that like any places, or, and being clear about like recommendations, but not saying like, oh, tell me about what you think the model's doing. Maybe more things like, hey, how does travel time understand like where you want to travel, that kind of stuff too. So asking again a bunch of questions around that, coupled with maybe some survey questions too, will take your qualitative more into the quantitative realm, and you can then do analysis on both. And then after, I might run them through again like 2 to 3 times entries around the experimental condition. It's also great because you get the same participants who just did the control, so they're in the entire process for this study. So you really understand like, hey, Ben always uses Kayak. He's expecting that, you know, Kayak should be able, or like our travel time should be able to behave in similar ways to Kayak, or not behave, or, you know, this type of improvement. Then they've gone through, experimented with the ML system. They can kind of understand what's going on. Having them actually reflect then about like, hey, what were some moments that surprised you? What are some moments that you really enjoyed? What are some ways that this is different than previous personalized traveling? What are some ways that you would like this to be more personalized? So Dscout is awesome, like I mentioned, because it allows for those open text fields, as well as like quantitative survey things. I think that these word clouds are great for understanding, like, hey, what are some adjectives that you would want to use around this too? Seeing something kind of bubble up too. And as well, you can do the counts by like tagging them. Also, my other favorite thing is that Dscout has, this turned into a huge promo for Dscout. Great job, Dscout. Dscout allows for the demographic information. So when you are screening participants and everything too, you can make sure that you have folks from all different education backgrounds, locations, represented in your participant pool, which might be different than if you were doing your moderated concept testing, which I know for me, I'm in the Bay Area, that might be limited to only people in the Bay Area, right? Unless I'm doing it over remotely, but that might be tricky if I'm doing like a Wizard of Oz study, for instance. So having them reflect on this is really important, because then you can understand, hey, what are other opportunities for our ML system that we haven't built out yet, all this type of stuff. Kind of bringing together the generative research with the evaluating the concept that we previously did. So just to reflect, if I were to make a Dscout study to really evaluate the prototype of an ML model or AI system, I first do the control, where the participants actually show me how they might use competitive offerings, how they currently solve this type of problem. Then I give them access to the prototype, the experimental condition, show me like, how is this prototype performing? Are there any weird answers that the model's giving that we can then fix before we launch it? And then reflect, like, are there opportunities that we are not tackling that you wish that we would do, maybe do better, that kind of thing too. And this is all part of the larger system of when I design UX research approaches for ML models and AI systems, starting initially first with that generative research, understanding those mental models, how people might recommend things to each other, how they might approach this, then evaluating the concepts, learn from the generative research around, what are the key things to have in a prototype or a concept, getting that feedback early on. So that way, when the machine learning scientists are building out that model, we can make sure we are building the right type of experience. So that way, when we go to evaluate the prototype, it really is like more fine tweak fixes and stuff too, those edge cases, like I mentioned, from machine learning system, because machine learning is probabilistic. So there will be edge cases that you were not expecting. And a big plug, like Dscout is great for the evaluating your prototype phase. So I know that was a lot of information, but if you're interested in learning more too, I just want to give a huge shout out for the People in AI Guidebook again, something that has definitely guided my practice. Like I mentioned, giant reason why I joined this team. It's fantastic. Totally look it up. It goes into details about all of these different chapters, like user needs, defining success, mental models, feedback and control, data collection and evaluation, explainability and trust, and errors and graceful failure. So not only do they go into chapters where like over 100 Googlers have, aggregated their knowledge into these best practices, case studies, all this stuff too. There's also worksheets. So there's chapter worksheets that are linked to at the top as well as at the bottom of every chapter, which you can actually do with your team. And I just think that they are fantastic and very, very well thought out. But like I mentioned, this is a brand new and emerging field, and it is something that is we are all still learning on, and feedback is very important. So this is funny because it's the feedback and control chapter, but we actually, on the entire guidebook, we have a feedback mechanism. So if you have thoughts, ideas, would like to see something else, you're using the guidebook in really interesting ways, definitely leave us some feedback. The team would love to see that as well. It's also something too, like I mentioned, like we're all kind of learning through this together. Might be my approach and best practice, but there might be things that really resonate with you, and there might be things that you're like, I don't feel like generative research is what we need. I really need to do that kind of more Dscout, evaluate the prototype approach, which is totally fine. And there's also a ton of really great things here in the guidebook too that I'm just barely skimming the surface. Lastly, I know I want to leave some time for questions too. If you are at all interested in meeting other cool folks who are doing this, we do have a meetup where we do meet in person. You can check it out at meetup.com/MLUXSF. Right now, the majority of our meetups are in San Francisco, but we are low-key doing some stuff in New York in the next month, so keep an eye out for that. That also has all of our past events and everything too. And if you're looking to, you see a cool meetup, and you're like, oh, I wish that I was able to attend that. Like our last one was actually with Feminist AI at Reddit. Our upcoming one is at Capgemini with Clink on chatbots and multimodal, and you're like, oh, I really wish I could attend, but I can't go in person. Good news, we have a YouTube channel. So you can actually go to our YouTube channel and watch our past talks and everything too. We record, most of them are up there. So really great talks, like from Salesforce, we did one earlier this year on AI for social good with salesforce.org, and how they approach, using AI for people problems, as well as we did one also with Salesforce on data-driven personas, so using unsupervised learning techniques in order to inform UX research approaches around personas. So really, really great stuff. Tony Chu, as well, from R2D3, A Visual Introduction to Machine Learning. He actually gave a talk for us on how to be a product designer for AI. So ton of really great resources there. Totally feel free to peruse. And lastly, we do have a Twitter handle, so at MLUXSF, and that's where we tweet out our upcoming events, any cool articles that we're seeing, all that stuff too. If you're interested in joining our LinkedIn group, I'll send that out to Ben and the team. If we do have a presence on LinkedIn, so totally check us out there. But these are probably some of the best ways to find us. And like I mentioned, we have 2 awesome events coming up just in the next month. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. So we have one next week, actually in San Francisco, on chatbots, conversation design, voice user interface design, and multimodal design with Clink, which is a startup from the incubator, or startup that is going to be in the Capgemini incubator space here in San Francisco. So we're really excited because Clink's approach is all about, like, how do we do multimodal from the beginning, which is fantastic. And they're going to share kind of like how they approach enterprise level chatbots and multimodal design, what that looks like, some of their tips and tricks, and like some best practices that we can all use, because I'm sure there's quite a few of us working in that domain. The other one that I want to plug too, we are doing our first ever non-Bay Area MLUX. We're partnering with Spotify Design to do an event on design for ML with Dai Dang and Christiana Che out in New York. So that's going to be October 17th. I've sent out the link to, be sure to, there's like a apply link within the Spotify Design website. So definitely check that out. Definitely, if you're in New York and you want to say hi, we would love to see you, especially if you work in this space too. So yeah, I'm trying to think about what else. I think that's it. I just wanted to say a big thank you to the Dscout team, especially Ben, Emmy, Zoe. Really thank you all so much for making those mocks and pulling those together, especially the Dscout screens. Wanted to thank my team, the Google AI UX team, which is also the umbrella team for the People in AI Research team. They are fantastic. They're working on a ton of cool stuff, so we'll be posting more about the cool stuff that I'm now up to on this team. Also, like, I may be the only one speaking right now from the MLUX community, but we actually have a ton of people on our steering committee who help lead these events, find venues and sponsors and speakers in this domain. And really thank you to you for attending. And I'm really excited to share this best practices and like how I approach this topic. If you're interested in saying hi, this is my email. Or if you want to speak at a future MLUX event, totally email me. Would love to chat with you. So yeah, thanks so much.
Michelle, thank you again. This was really, really cool. We have so many questions to get to. A few of them were about the MLUX startup and other locations. I think you did a good job answering those. I want to dive now into some of the questions about research. The top-rated question right now is from Jennifer, who asks, my question would be how you come up with quick and dirty ML prototypes, thinking less about training it or testing an algorithm, really faking the functionality. Do you have any examples of quick and dirty ML prototypes that you get in the hands of users?
Oh my gosh, I love that question. So I think it's really important to do basic level ML prototyping. I mentioned too, my background is also in UI engineering. I come from the ML data science space. A lot of the machine learning that we end up building is just like custom based off of the already pre-built models that are out there. So for instance, Word2Vec, like PoseNet, a bunch of these already existing models. I think like using tools like ML5.js, which is a JavaScript framework which has a bunch of pre-trained ML models. It's trained on giant corpuses as well. You can totally check them out on GitHub. I can send you all a link too. I take that and put that into like a Bootstrap template website to just kind of get the concept of what machine learning is doing in front of users and being like, hey, like, I might use like pre-skinned to whatever product it looks like and be like, this model is not very good. You know, the server is all the way in like Arizona, that's like far away from California. So like, what do you think it should be doing? Like here, try and play around with it. You can kind of see like it does it maybe 60% of the way as you'd expect, but how would you want to improve that system? Just talking about UX research for machine learning prototyping too, I think Wizard of Oz testing is a great approach to that. So like I had mentioned too, if you are working with voice user interfaces, that might be like Bluetoothing into a smart home speaker in the other room and sending over MP3s to make it sound like it is the assistant, kind of like, or whatever voice assistant you're using, speaking back in the same script as you would expect for an ML system. So building it out like you are with your ML prototype that will be built that you would later test. Or paper prototyping, I think is a great methodology too. Instead of using the classic like one piece of paper per screen, I actually just do one piece of paper for the entire application and then like maybe change out elements. So cut like modules and then be like, okay, you just gave feedback that you don't like LA, and I might flip the card over and it's Roswell, New Mexico, and be like, this is what came up instead. Like, how would you feel about that? So yeah, paper prototyping, but keeping it modular, and even having the participant maybe co-create with that too, and designing along, I think is a fun way to do that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We'll be sure to get some of those resources out that Michelle mentioned. That's great, Michelle. It's great to hear how you are still very much piecing together the practice, because the models are quite literally learning as you're working, or are you're sometimes playing catch up, sometimes innovating the actual model. But then once you press play, it's the basis of it is it's to learn. And to that point, we have a lot of questions that revolve around how you as a researcher focused on and trained in user research methods broadly bring stakeholders who are more quantitatively minded to understand and see the value of more qualitative methods. So a long way of asking, how do you build bridges between teams that might not be integrated like they are at Google or other places, wherein the digital or the machine learning teams are very quantitatively savvy, and some of our attendees might be on those more qualitatively minded teams for whom advocating for these methods is a challenge. Do you have any tips or advice on how they can get a seat at the table, or kinds of outputs or deliverables that really work? I know for me as a researcher, I always like showing engineers and product designers videos. Like those videos you shared. I always find that a quote with a video exemplifying what's going on, and then maybe some of the light quantitative you shared is really useful. But what do you think?
Yes, that is a great question. I think what I always tell machine learning scientists, quant people, BI engineers, whatever, is like the models that we are making are not made in a vacuum. Like you are not just making them for no one or just cool ML science or whatever. These are going to end up being used by people, and your UX qualitative researchers, your UX designers, they are your gateway to your end user. So bringing them along to understand, hey, what is this model doing? What data are the inputs? What do we expect to be the outputs? What do we expect the experience to be? Only further improves not only how people are going to use this model, but potentially helps you get data for future models that you don't even have yet through building in feedback mechanisms. That's something too that that is a pretty important step in the machine learning or just like data science process, is like getting models or data for future models. And also like that's all about UX, about like building trust with your end user, about like, hey, like this is why we're giving you this recommendation, like reason codes, as well as like like surfacing to them, like, if you give us feedback, this is how we will then use it for future models, or things like that too. Being transparent about, like, why is the model giving me this type of input? It just makes better machine learning experiences. So really advocating for, like, hey, this model is going to be used by a ton of people. You need me in the room to not only help design the interface and like how it is going to behave, but also improve it for future models that might not exist yet. So
that's great. And Jake, Jake's question is the next top voted one. And I think you have implicitly answered it. He asks, when and how does the research you just described influence how the machine learning model is designed? Is it merely, just experience design, or can it influence how the model is designed? And it sounds like it very well can. You need to make the case to those who are doing the designing that these data, where, while they might not be the X's and O's or the ones and zeros that make the model, they should inform how the model responds to data. Do you have any other thoughts on how the research that you described here can and should influence how the model is learned or designed or trained or set upon user data?
Yeah, so a lot of times in machine learning, it's not like a model is like one and done. It needs to be updated over time. Like what we built like 5 years ago might not work for now. So like, what does that look like to have an ongoing system and everything too? So at least getting into that process of like, hey, I am your partner in creating, like as a designer or a qualitative researcher, I am your partner in creating better experiences for people. And so if we can get it in this round, it is so much easier for future rounds. It only improves the model for future rounds as well. And being able to extrapolate that away too, to be like, hey, not only did we have a win with this product where we incorporated UX into the machine learning process, but here's like key takeaways about how we could do it in the future too. Speaking about the machine learning process and everything too, I fully think that it can be in parallel, like UX research can be done in parallel with building out the model, as long as like the machine learning machine learning data scientists understand like, we are testing out, are we building the right experience for machine learning? And, the core of the machine learning probably won't change that much, but building the machine learning model from the start to allow for feedback is a really important step. Just like, it's really hard to build a system that allows for feedback when it wasn't made to accept feedback. So knowing that that's coming down the pipeline, knowing that, this is the type of input that we will be giving as UX researchers, I think is all really important.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Michelle. I love thinking about how the user experience researchers, designers, and just human-centered thinkers broadly can influence these machine learning models in how they're designed to accept future feedback. That is so vital when, again, you're working with something that might falsely be thought to be very static. Once you press play, that's it. Oh gosh, we've missed our chance. So great. Thanks to all of you who asked questions that touched on that. We are out of time this month. Michelle, thank you so much again for your time. To the attendees, thank you for spending a little bit of yours with us. The recording will be sent out. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.